Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about the best recordings of Rachmaninoff's most popular symphony. That is Symphony Number 2. Now, for all of its popularity, Symphony Number 2 is a tricky piece to play, and it has a somewhat confused history because it's a very long symphony. It's also a very dark symphony, at least in the first movement, and to some extent in the slow movement too. And as a result of that, Rachmaninoff sanctioned cuts in the score to trim it down to size, really reducing it quite a bit. I mean, if you do the whole thing with the exposition repeat that most of us didn't even know existed for most of our lives, it can last almost an hour. 50, 55 minutes, even longer in slow performances. And with the cuts, it lasts like 40, 45 minutes. So they make a big difference. There's a lot of chopping and slicing and hacking. And nowadays, it's extremely unusual to hear performances that use the traditional cuts. They just aren't done, especially at this day of authenticity and everything being played, come scritto, as they say in Italian, as written in the score. We tend not to want to make cuts and things like that. And frankly, they're not necessary. It's a very, very, very beautiful work, even though it does have some interpretive pitfalls. So if you're going to do the whole thing, what's the issue? Well, the issues are these. First of all, the first movement, like I said, has an exposition repeat that nobody knew existed. I even think the finale has an exposition repeat that nobody knew existed. I mean, it can really stretch out. You should not take exposition repeats, generally. Some great performances do, but I think it really works much better without them. One of the things about the first movement that makes it particularly tricky is that there's a certain uniformity of texture. It's very, very string heavy. And like most Rachmaninoff symphonies, it has a motto theme that begins, do 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 do. It's dark. It's in the basses, the cellos and basses, and then the other piece of the motto is ya-do. The violins come in, ya da 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 da. Da, 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 da. It's a somewhat amorphous motto. It's not like the opening of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, bum, ba-da-da-dum, bum, bum, the fanfare that's like big and loud and boisterous, or even Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, da, 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 dum, ba, right? I mean, if there's something very catchy, something with a really strong rhythmic shape. Rachmaninoff's mottos are never that way. They're always kind of murky sounding. Now, it doesn't mean you don't recognize them or hear them when they come back, but they are quite fluid. And as a result of that, there's a big, long introduction. And that introduction is so long and so sort of extensively developed, but at the same time, so thematically amorphous that it's almost difficult to tell where the symphony starts. I mean, the actual movement. It's rather complicated. And the first theme in the violins, ya da 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 da. It sounds a lot like the motto. It probably is developed from the motto, but we don't really know because everything sounds like everything else. Rachmaninoff had this habit of writing tunes, however beautiful they are, that are based on sort of a really piano figuration, this sort of da 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 ba da 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 da. He was left-handed, and you can almost hear somebody's left hand on the bottom of the keyboard doing this do 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 do. It's a feature of Rachmaninoff's style. It's instantly recognizable. And so it's a trait of character. It's not a defect, but you have to get used to it. And the first movement of this symphony has everything is scored for violins, basically. And so as a result of that, it can sound like a big, giant, gray blob. And so it has to be conducted to give it rhythm and shape and phrasing. The second subject is one of those incredibly gorgeous Russian romantic Rachmaninoff / Tchaikovsky type tunes. I mean, it's marvelous, but you have to really give it some focus. And that's the problem with the first movement. The scherzo is marvelous. It presents no issue other than the fact that in the recapitulation, in the when the A section returns after a marvelous central section, it's a fugue with a march and a stuff. The main tune goes to the glockenspiel, and you've got to hear the glockenspiel. I say that as a glockenspielist. When the glockenspiel goes do 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 boo 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 boo, and you better hear it. And there's a lot of very soft writing for percussion, snare drum and cymbals. It's good to hear those things. The slow movement is an issue. The slow movement features the theme that became Eric Carmen's song, "I'm Never Gonna Fall in Love Again." Remember? And I'm never gonna fall in love again. Da 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 da. I don't remember something about pain and suffering, and but it's a gorgeous melody. Here's the irony of it, though: it never comes back, ever. I mean, the opening few notes, do 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 do, that comes back. But the whole tune never comes back. And God, you want to hear it again because it's so beautiful. I mean, the actual thematic material is also very beautiful. But this is a long, slow movement. And again, like the first movement, although the principal melody goes to the clarinet, it can be somewhat amorphous. And, the middle section of the slow movement features the motto theme. And it's sort of sequential. It's like you hear it repeating over and over again. And there are moments where you kind of wonder, how are we going to get out of this? It's like getting stuck in a very attractive location. But no matter how attractive it is, I remember once we were on a family trip to Gettysburg. And it was a lovely trip. And we decided, my father and me and my brother, well, my mother and sister were out doing something else, shopping or something. I don't know. We decided to take a tour bus around Gettysburg. And, it was one of those buses. It was a tourist bus. This was like in the, 70s or 60s. It was fairly early in my life. And it had one of those, tapes where, you go by the landmark and it said, "This is the house where Betsy Ross sewed the American flag," or something like that, And so we're zipping around Gettysburg. I mean, Betsy Ross, I guess, was earlier, but someone was baking bread and got shot during the Battle of Gettysburg. That's what I remember. And for some reason, they wouldn't let us off the bus. They kept going round and around and around. We kept hearing the same thing. "This is the house where so-and-so was breaking bread and got shot," and we didn't know how we would ever get off of this bus. It went on for like 2 hours, and it was really very, very funny. But, it was a nice trip. We really memorized all the historic sites of Gettysburg. The slow movement of Rachmaninoff, too, is kind of like that. It sort of goes around and around, and you don't know how you're going to get out of it. In fact, there's one point where it just stops. It just sort of peters out, and there's a pause, and then the clarinet comes in, do, 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 and then the flute plays the motto, do, 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 like that, and it just starts up again, and you're like, oh, where are we in this? So again, it requires a performance that keeps it moving, that understands ebb and flow, as we call it, and that really knows how to shape that movement into something more than a big, lovely, warm, romantic pudding. It needs to have a little bit more focus. The finale, again, no special problems. It needs just to be kept moving. It needs to be exciting. That's all. There is a tendency in Russian performance, especially, to add a few extra cymbal crashes and doodle the parts as we get towards the big climax at the end, particularly before the big melody comes in. And this is something about Rachmaninoff, too. There are a couple tweaks in orchestration that can be really annoying in this symphony. I mean, for example, in the finale, the big tune, da 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 da. Well, just before that comes in, there's a tendency to add a cymbal crash where there's a pause. It's crash, da, 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 da. That's not what Rachmaninoff wrote. And what he wrote is so much more effective because what he wanted was an intake of breath. It's you're coming up to it and it's da, 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 da. It's an exhalation. All of that's wrecked if you throw a big cymbal crash before it. And I'm kind of amazed that conductors don't have the sense and taste to figure that out. I mean, it's not evil to have a cymbal crash. It's exciting, I mean, I understand it. It works in its own way, but it turns something which is really characteristic and romantic and poetic into something which is completely conventional. And that annoys me. I mean, it doesn't wreck the performance. I'm not, I used to get all hepped up about this stuff. And there's another point that people get even more hepped up about, and that's the end of the first movement. The end of the first movement is for the double basses and cellos. It's just whoomph. That's it. The orchestra's going bump, 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 whoomph, like that. And there is a tendency to back that with a hard stroke on the timpani, sometimes really hard, sometimes it's a whack. It's like a hammer blow in Mahler's Sixth. That's also wrong. Why is it wrong? I understand, again, the point of adding a timpani there. I mean, the timpani are it makes the movement sound more final at the end, in a way. I don't think it actually does. Why? Because there's a rhetorical aspect to what Rachmaninoff did. The last note, the last word, let's think in terms of sentences and grammar, right? You have a sentence, and the sentence ends with stop that now, right? And then after the word now, because it's a sentence, you put a period. The period is it doesn't convey meaning. It just means stop. That's what Rachmaninoff does. It's dun dun bum 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 whoomph. It's a period. It's a piece of musical punctuation. It is not a word. It's not as important as the actual verbal meaning of the phrase. The phrase ends with the last big full chord in the orchestra, while the cellos and basses simply add the period that says, okay, that's the end. I think it's marvelous the way Rachmaninoff did it. I really do. And again, you put the timpani there, it doesn't ruin it, but it takes something imaginative and characteristic and turns it into something completely conventional and generic. And we don't want generic, right? So it doesn't wreck a performance if a conductor does it. I get the point. I mean, if Rachmaninoff wanted to have a timpani shot there's no reason he couldn't have. He's got 3 drums. He's in the tonic key. He could do whatever he wants, It was not a period in musical history where you had to not write timpani parts because you couldn't tune your drums. But it's a shame. It's really a shame when people mess with him without bothering to think or considering that what he may have done may have had a poetic and musical purpose. And it may be an interesting or characteristic point of the composer's personal style. So those are the textual issues. And let me play you the ending. I mean, I've got it here from the new Leonard Slatkin recording on Naxos, which is superb, and we'll get to that. Here's the ending the way Rachmaninoff wrote it. And you'll see exactly what I mean. Listen here. See what I mean? Get it? It's the ending is the last loud chord where the cellos and basses just put a period on it. And that's what we're hearing. Anyway, now let's talk about the recordings. I've got 15 of them here, and we'll talk about more than that because there are so many recordings. Oh my God, so many recordings. And so many lousy recordings. I mean, many, many, many not very good ones. And some of these we're going to talk about I don't like very much, but I'll mention them and you'll draw your own conclusions. I, generally speaking, ignore performances with cuts. So that rules out virtually everything before a certain date. I make one exception. Well, there were two. There were 2 really good ones. One was with Alfred Wallenstein. It was on It was on EMI back in the day, and it was really a lovely performance. I enjoyed it very much. But the one, and there was an Adrian Bolt recording too, but I that was not one of the better ones. The single cut version that we need to take into account is Ormandy in Philadelphia. And the reason is because Ormandy, of course, knew Rachmaninoff. These were cuts that Rachmaninoff apparently sanctioned. And so there is some authority to playing this version, and this is the best performance of it ever. So if you want to hear the cut version of the symphony, Ormandy in Philadelphia on Sony is your guy. Now, Ormandy remade the symphony for RCA, and he did it complete. He opened up all the cuts. And everyone said at the time, and I kind of understand, he wasn't quite as comfortable doing it without the cuts. It's not a bad performance by any means, but there are better ones that are complete and uncut than Ormandy's. But it was bold of him to do it. So he gets kudos for the attempt. Now, I have here 3 performances, at least, that come from complete sets. And they are of varying degrees of quality. Ashkenazi with the Concertgebouw. Now, this performance, I think we talked about this. This performance got a lot of acclaim when it came out. It was the first in this cycle. I never much cared for it. I think it's a little bit murky, a little bit lacking in focus, and the sound is not as good as the later ones in this cycle, which contains the best ever performance of the First Symphony. And as some of you may know, and as I already said in my video on the First Symphony, I like the First Symphony better than I like the Second Symphony. It's grittier. I think I think it's more effectively structured in some ways. It's much more well integrated motivically and thematically, and I think that it's more interesting in terms of its content. And the ending is a knockout with the tam-tam crashing and all that stuff going on, hell breaking loose. The Second Symphony is more popular because it's more romantic. It's more obviously melodic. It's more lyrical. I understand the popularity. I really do. But I think the first is a much more interesting piece of music. That's me. You may disagree. Next, this hot Svetlanov Canyon Classics, which I think is also on Melodia, which it's popped around this box, which I always bring up, and then all of you guys write to me and say, I can't find it. Oh God, where is it? And I say, I know. Some of you have found it. These are, he says, late Svetlanov, stunningly recorded. It's a knockout. Just a knockout. These are great performances. They are big, heavy, slow, Russian, pulverizing, apocalyptic. It's pedal to the metal from first note to last, and it's very, very exciting and slightly diddled orchestrally, but Next, this is really, I think, one of the best modern cycles. I really think it's probably my favorite. Maris Jansen's with the St. Petersburg Symphony or St. Petersburg Philharmonic, whatever they were called after they stopped being Leningrad. The St. Petersburg Philharmonic. You get great performances of 1, 2, and 3, great symphonic dances. And also the piano concertos with Mikhail Rudy, and they're pretty good. This is a really, really good set on EMI Warner. Jansen's, of course, recorded the Second Symphony previously for Chandos, I think, with the Oslo Philharmonic. It was boring. This is not boring. This is nice and clean and tense and rhythmic and full of drive. I think these are fine performances. They are not the greatest sonically. I don't mean that they're bad, but they're sort of, quasi-early-ish digitals, and they need to be turned up and sort of fiddled with to sound their best. But they're very, very, very good. Now let's talk about singleton performances, of which I have a huge stack. There is one other cycle I just want to mention, though, that I think we should avoid. Charles Dutoit with the Philadelphia Orchestra and Decca. It's been re-released on Eloquence. It was so lame. It really was. I mean, the playing's very good. Dutoit just, he doesn't have the fire in his belly to play that music. And it's a shame because he had Philadelphia. It could have been magnificent. The sonics were okay. It wasn't great. There was something faded about the whole thing. And it just has not held up. Wasn't a thrill when it came out. So, all right. First, Tamerkanov with the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. Now, these were sort of going on at the same time as Jansen's was going on, and you've also got the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. Now, I have a delightful story that goes with this particular recording. When I was a kid, no, back in my early youthful critical days, I saw Tamerkanov, I think it was St. Petersburg on tour, conduct this symphony. And the head of BMG was there as well, a man of great dignity, shall we say, and not exactly the brightest bulb in the chandelier, if you know what I mean. So I was there with Victor Carr Jr., who writes for ClassicsToday.com, who's a marvelous critic, and who has particular expertise when it comes to Russian music. So whenever we had something Russian, we both made sure that we would go see it together. And so the two of us were there watching this performance. Now, one thing about Tamerkanov as an interpreter is that his live performances are very different from his recordings. What I mean is cuts. He would play something absolutely complete on disc and cut the living daylights out of it in concert, because for some reason he feels, as a lot of conductors from this Russian tradition seem to, that live audiences have no patience to sit through something. And so he whacked the crap out of Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony when I saw him do it. And this. Now, the cuts here mostly occurred in the finale. But the finale, it was unbelievable. All I could say is it was unbelievable. In this performance, the finale takes 14 minutes long. I don't think it took 5 live. The finale went like this. You ready? That was the finale. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the cuts were so grotesque. I mean, they were right, in such bad places, and they made such jarring harmonic nonsense out of it. Especially toward the very end, it's building up to a big climax. All of a sudden, there's this big cymbal crash that Rachmaninoff didn't want to say, crash, and then the last theme comes in and it ends. Anyway, we just sat there like, could not believe what we were hearing, and as we were leaving, the head of BMG accosted us and said, "Wasn't that fabulous?" And we said, "Well, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, it was very exciting. It was very well played." And he said, "And he's recording that." And Victor and I looked at him and we said to him, "Is he going to do it with the cuts?" And he looked at us quizzically and said, "Cuts? What cuts?" And we just went, "Okay, next." So, no cuts, just so you know. And it's a very good performance, but we have to talk about Tamerkanov again, anon. So stay tuned. Here we go. Also, a very, very fine performance. This is Lytton with the Royal Philharmonic. It's really first class, absolutely first class. This is on Virgin. This was a very, very good Rachmaninoff symphony cycle. I still love it, and it actually. I wish it were still available. Lytton is wonderful generally in Russian music too. He's another one of those guys who just really nails the Russians. And so if you can still find this and you want to hear it, it's very well recorded. Terrific. That was on Virgin, so now it's EMI. This one was a real sleeper, and I still enjoy this tremendously. This is David Zinman and Baltimore with the exposition repeat in the first movement. This came as a complete surprise. Now, Zinman, as you know, he's not a hot and heavy, panting, romantic Russian type. He tends to be light. He's hopped on the period instrument bandwagon as regards, sort of period performances with modern orchestras of classical repertoire, and he does them very well. This is a really, really lively, beautifully played, wonderfully recorded. I don't know. It has light. It's not dark. It's not gloomy. It's amazing, really, that it works so well. And it really does. It's first class, absolutely first class, and well worth hearing. The other one that actually, this was the performance that taught us that there was an exposition repeat in the first movement. I think this was the first guy to ever take it. I don't know, does it have timings here? Of course, no timings. I would remember better, but I think this is the one that did it because I haven't listened to this one again, and I probably should have, but I love this performance. you can only take so many Rachmaninoff 2s in a row. You know what I mean? Gennady Rozhdestvensky with the London Symphony. This was first on like Pickwick or some label. I don't remember. It was sort of a rainbow-colored yellow thing. And you get a sticker that says LSO Concerts up to 50% off if you like, go in and show your CD. Anyway, this is, Rozhdestvensky is one of those heavy-duty Russian conductors, right? Everything is kind of slow and kind of dark and kind of mucoid if you're not careful. But when he's on, he's terrific. And this was a very, very good performance, exciting performance in the Russian style, that sort of heavy, dark style. And really, Svetlanov kind of goes in one better, I suppose. But this, I think, had the exposition repeat, too, which was like, oh, okay. There's 4 minutes longer than you ever thought it could be in the first movement. But it works. It worked. It was a very committed performance. Now, this is a performance I also don't like. It got a lot of acclaim when it came out. Pletnev and the Russian National Orchestra on Deutsche Grammophon. Why did it get acclaim? Well, because Pletnev played everything fast and light. So it didn't really sound Russian. It sounded kind of balletic. And people just love the balletic part because it sounded different. There's a tendency, in the critical world, when you've heard 400 versions of everything, to overvalue something that doesn't sound the same as usual. It's not the same old, same old. And I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to it because I've done it. And I've come to regret it sometimes. It happens to all of us. But that same old has to have staying power, and it has to be interesting in its own right. This is not. This is a very underplayed performance. It's quick, it's light, it's somewhat colorless, it's somewhat indifferently recorded sonically. It has very little power, very little impact. At the time, everyone thought it was such a big deal, and boy, listening to it now, I have no idea why. And I did listen to this one again. I don't get it. I don't get it. I was trying to convince myself, as so many of us were, that this was new and fresh and special. No, just lacking in ideas from a guy who hadn't quite learned how to conduct. And the sad thing about it is that once he did learn to conduct, we liked him better when he didn't know how to conduct. So that's Pletnev. Now this one also got a ton of acclaim when it came out. This was the Andrei Previn London Symphony one, because he, of course, remade it, not terribly well for Telarc. But this one was very good. Previn also was a very good Russian music conductor. However, the funny thing about this, and I have to show, maybe we should just jump ahead, is that the Previn was around at the same time as the first Temirkanov. And the first Temirkanov is with the Royal Philharmonic, and it's a knockout. It is one of the great performances of the Second Symphony. It still is. It was always my reference recording. It's one of my reference recordings. I'm keeping it as one of my reference recordings. I'm telling you it's one of my reference recordings. It is much more exciting than Previn and the LSO. But because Previn and the LSO was the darling of the British critical fraternity, he got all the attention, and this one was completely ignored. It was on the same label. It's exactly what happened, by the way, when Simon Rattle started doing Sibelius symphonies at the same time that Paavo Berglund was redoing them with the Helsinki Philharmonic, and they simply put Berglund on hold for years so they could rave about Simon Rattle's horrible, mediocre, useless, worthless piece of trash Sibelius cycle from Birmingham. Whereas, it was the same situation here. This is the great Rachmaninoff 2. This is a very good Rachmaninoff 2. This one even sounds better than this one, than Previn. So if you want to get one of the great Rachmaninoff 2s that you got to hear is Temirkanov, but it's always been hard to find. EMI always treated it badly because it never got the attention it deserved in the English press. And it's coupled with Previn's Manfred Symphony, which is probably the dullest performance of Manfred ever, which is really a pity. So it's on this twofer where, one disc is like horrendous, and then you get this amazing Rachmaninoff Second Symphony. So there you are. Temirkanov 1. Fabulous. Best first movement climax you've ever heard in your life. It's incredible. Here's a real sleeper that I will bet most of you have not heard. It's on AV with Sinfonia Varsovia and Jose Cura. I mean, I may be just, blowing gas here, as they say, because no one's going to pay attention to this or me for liking it. But it's a first-class performance of Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. It really is. It's absolutely terrific. It's on AV. It may still be on AV. I don't even know if it still exists. Came out of nowhere. It's really, really good. It's really good. Now we're down to the last two. And my top three, I mean, just to be clear, one of them is this Timirkanov. It has to be. It's just fabulous. These are recent recordings. And like I said, I have a bias, and I freely admit it. I have a bias toward preferring recordings by people who aren't dead or that have come out more recently, simply because I just think it's so important to emphasize that there are great performances happening today, that all the great performers aren't dead, that people who are sunk in nostalgia for the past, for the greatness that was the golden age of this, the golden age of that, it's all bullshit, it's bunk, it's nonsense. They're just not listening. They simply aren't listening, because there is greatness all around us. And so my two favorite versions belong to the greatness all around us category of Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony performances. The first is Slatkin with the Detroit Symphony. This is absolutely first class. It is a live recording. It has the excitement of a live performance. It's beautifully, beautifully well done. Slatkin is a Russian music master. He recorded all the Rachmaninoff symphonies for Vox in St. Louis. You may recall they were surprisingly good, given who the orchestra was, and that he was young, and that, they were sort of starting off in their world, and they did a very good job with them. But this is much better. This is even better. This is mature, considered, but just as exciting and spontaneous and intelligent and beautifully done. And it's a great cycle of all three symphonies, which is now available on Naxos, and you really should hear them. This is absolutely fabulous. However, if I had to pick one modern recording, one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, to quote J.R.R. Tolkien. As far as Rachmaninoff's Second Symphonies go, The Lord of the Rings, or The Lord of the Rachmaninoff Twos, is a modern recording, and it's this one, Ivan Fischer with the Budapest Festival Orchestra on Channel Classics. First of all, if you like SACDs, this you have to have. Second of all, it is technically stunning, absolutely superb. But beyond that, it doesn't take the exposition repeat in the first movement. Yay! Beyond that, it combines the best of everything. It has the weight of sonority of the best Russian recordings, but it has that lightness and flow that keeps the music moving in the first movement and in the adagio in the third movement. It is gorgeously played. The Budapest strings are one of the great string sections in the world, and this is a symphony, as I said at the beginning, that lives or dies on the weight of its string playing. It needs to have magnificent string playing, and it gets it here. But everyone else is wonderful. Again, the brass play beautifully. The climaxes are well built and well structured. The playing in the scherzo is taut and rhythmic. The finale is a wonderful culmination of the whole piece. It never dies. It doesn't drag. This is it. This is the whole package. Ivan Fischer, Budapest Festival Orchestra, Channel Classics, Rachmaninoff Second Symphony. You have to hear it if you love the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony. And that is the summary. It's been quite a long one, hasn't it? This was a gesunte talk, as we used to say, and my grandparents would tell me. It was a whole Megillah of Rachmaninoff's Second Symphonies. And there are lots more. Like I said, I know I may not have mentioned your personal favorite, but the point is there are more than enough here to give you all the Rachmaninoff 2 you will ever want to hear in your lifetime. I guarantee it. Notwithstanding which, we should always keep on listening. Thank you for joining me. Take care.